Now, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is on the cusp of announcing his presidential bid, scheduled to discuss his ambitions with Elon Musk, who we've just been speaking about. They'll be streaming on Twitter Spaces together in a discussion moderated by tech entrepreneur and DeSantis supporter David Sachs. This is a long-awaited announcement, but to announce his presidency alongside Musk on Twitter Spaces, is DeSantis opening himself up to controversy? Well, I spoke a bit earlier to former White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer. Sean, Ron DeSantis was considered the front runner just a few months ago. Now Trump is in the lead according to the polls. Why has some of the gloss come off DeSantis?
Well, I think President Trump had the opportunity to really take some hits at DeSantis and his campaign and his credibility and his character over the time while he was still presiding over the Florida legislature when he wasn't able to announce a run. And he took advantage of that. He talked about his record. He talked about why DeSantis, in his opinion, wasn't conservative enough, why his policies were out of touch in some ways. He had a free shot over and over again until DeSantis was able to, A, wrap up the legislative session in Florida, and B, change a little law in Florida that was at best questionable, that had required candidates to resign if they were to run for another office.
Elon Musk is going to be hosting a Twitter conversation with DeSantis when he's expected to announce his candidacy. Musk says he isn't endorsing anyone, but clearly he thinks DeSantis will be a better presidential candidate than Trump. He says DeSantis can win. Does he have a point here?
Well, there's a few things that you bring up, Sharri. Number one, can DeSantis win? Yes. I think he could win a general against Biden, but I still think, as you pointed out earlier, President Trump is definitely the favorite when it comes to the nomination. And it's not just about polls. I've been doing a series of videos on YouTube where I've been explaining to people the process, how delegates are selected in the Republican Party. And Trump has a huge advantage when it comes to organization and delegate allocation. And so I explain this in a series of YouTube videos that I've been doing, but that actually, in my opinion, is stronger than his standing in the polls, because he has this ability to manipulate the process and help these state parties craft rules that benefit his campaign. That aside, I mean, look, I think that the DeSantis strategy to announce a bid for president in a Twitter Spaces moderated discussion is interesting at best. I'm not sure that it was the best way to garner the most attention, but it definitely tries to play this idea that he is tech savvy, he's hip, he might play with the younger voters. But remember, in the Republican Party, the bulk of the voters are older. And I'm really not sure that you're reaching the people that are going to be the key grassroots voters.
You said that it's unusual that DeSantis has chosen Twitter Spaces as the platform to launch his candidacy, and I think most people wouldn't even know how to access Twitter Spaces, but maybe he's trying to take advantage of Elon Musk's 140 million Twitter followers. Is this part of the strategy? And are there also risks with taking this path?
Well, look, I think my point would be, it's not, I don't know who Musk's 100 million followers are. We do know that, as I said earlier, the key to the nomination is largely through the early states. You have to go to Iowa, then New Hampshire, Nevada, and South Carolina. So from a Republican standpoint, the question isn't how many you reach, but are you reaching the right people? And I just think at best, the strategy to launch on Twitter is questionable for a number of reasons. As I put a moment ago, it's not just the states that matter, but it's also the age and the demographic of who you're trying to reach. Normally, you want a very scripted announcement. Why? Because everyone's going to cover that. That's the one thing that you can control.
I want to move on to the US debt ceiling crisis. We're getting very close to the so-called X date in June. Isn't it incumbent on both sides to reach a deal here?
Yes, but I want to just make sure that your audience understands something. So that our Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, has said that June 1st is what she considers the hard deadline. It's not a matter of just getting a deal before June 1st, though. And if a deal was reached, then they have to draft the legislative text for that. They have to have, our Congressional Budget Office has to what they call score it, meaning it has to go in and do the math, if you will, and say, okay, this is what this will do. And then thirdly, there's a requirement to have 72 hours for members of Congress to review the text. So if you start doing that, at best, you're talking 5 days. So you have to take 5 days off of June 1st. And that puts us early next week. And it's a 3-day weekend here in America. It's Memorial Day on Monday. I think we are getting awful close to this deadline. And then to your question, do both sides have to give? Yes, to some degree. But remember, number one, the House of Representatives did pass an extension of the debt ceiling. They wanted spending reforms. And prior to that, President Biden hadn't met with Speaker McCarthy in almost 100 days. They've known this crisis was coming. He spent a weekend ago at his beach house. He flew across the world the other day. This is not a president who is taking this crisis seriously, and he hasn't put forward a proposal. But make no mistake, America is in this crisis because both parties have spent too much. We have a spending problem. We spent over $31 trillion in debt as a nation right now. And until at least both parties recognize that needs to be addressed, we're never going to solve it. We're just going to keep kicking the can down the road, increasing the debt ceiling, and then several months later having to go through this exercise again.
Joe Biden was meant to be in Australia this week for the Quad. He cancelled that meeting to try and deal with the debt ceiling crisis and negotiate an agreement. Do you think he realises that should the US default, that would have global consequences? Do you think he actually realises the weight of what he's dealing with?
It's a great question, because if he had realized it, he would have been dealing with it a lot earlier. We've been talking about this since Republicans took the majority back in January, but I want to get to the point that you made about the Quad meeting. This was going to be a big deal for your prime minister to host this in his hometown, as I understand, and it would have been a source of personal and national pride. Joe Biden's failure to address this issue insulted Australia, and I think rightly so. They should be peeved. So instead of addressing this problem, he ignored House Republicans domestically here for 100 days. Then he scheduled a meeting and ended up having to cancel it, which insulted the Australian people and your prime minister. And then leaving the only people who are happy about Joe Biden's action, the Chinese. It is amazing for a president, in my opinion, who came in talking about restoring bonds and friendships and relationships around the world, to continue to mess up these relationships astronomically. I mean, he did that after we pulled out of Afghanistan, with the deals that we've tried to strike with Australia and other of our key allies. It's amazing for a president who touted his foreign policy experience as one of his greatest strengths to see how many times he has done things that have undermined our relationships.
Sean, I think it's such an important point, and it wasn't just a big deal because it insulted Australia and our Prime Minister, but the very existence of the Quad, the very reason it was so important for the Quad to meet is for security in our region, because China's becoming more and more aggressive, and this was sending a strong message to Beijing. So again, his failure to reach an early agreement on the debt ceiling, to leave it to the last minute, has national security implications as well. Sean Spicer, great insight. Thank you very much for your time.
Always good to see you, Sharri.